Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, The Day in Her Life. So today we're right in the middle of World War II, alongside of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. So the war was a tremendous thing to deal with. So let us see what Bertie and Elizabeth had to do to keep the UK safe. Well, Bertie first met up with the ambassador to Great Britain, and he wasn't giving news that Bertie agreed with. So Joe Kennedy was the ambassador for England from the United States, and he thought that the war would be a financial and material disaster for Britain. He thought that Hitler should be allowed to occupy Eastern Europe, which shouldn't matter to England because they were of little use to them money-wise. So that made Bertie worried, because he said the war with Germany was that of moral principles, and that was what was at stake. And the king got kind of mad about it, so he wrote a letter to Kennedy, and he let him know he wasn't happy. And Bertie told them that there were only three really free peoples in the world: the United States, France, and the British Empire. He said that England and France were fighting against Hitler and the Nazi regime and all that it stands for. And Bertie said England was a part of Europe and it upheld the rights of smaller nations. He also told Kennedy that his country's prestige in the world remained high. So Joe Kennedy felt that he may have made Bertie mad with his first letter, so he tried to backpedal it a little bit. And he said that he acknowledged Britain's position in Europe and he held Bertie in the highest esteem. Kennedy said that the Roosevelt administration wished to help England and France by sending money, but no American troops to Europe. Joe Kennedy let it be known in private and in public that he felt Germany was superior in their military power and would beat Britain. He didn't want American troops there, and they met for the last time in November 1939. After they met for lunch, Joe Kennedy thought the king didn't look very well. He thought he was thin and stuttered more than he had before, and he thought the queen was sweet as usual. Kennedy didn't want to eat the main course, which was roast hare, so he told her to her face, "Madam, I don't like it." And she said, "What an honest man," and offered him pheasant instead. So Joe said later that he tried to get through it. The Britons at first liked Kennedy, but later turned against him. Harold Nicholson thought he was a cowardly and conceited man, and Bertie felt like Kennedy had no fight in him, and that all he thought about was money, against the terms of human feelings. When Joe Kennedy left Bertie, they never saw each other again. Now the duties. The king had things to do, and Elizabeth would sometimes join him, but mostly she was doing a lot of things on her own. So this happened during what they were calling the phony war, when nothing was going on in England at that time. And she would visit regiments, hospitals, schools, factories, and volunteer organizations. She wanted to keep everyone's morale going. Lord Tweedsmuir got Queen Elizabeth to speak words of encouragement to women and those abroad from the radio, and she did it November the 11th, 1939, Armistice Day. The Archbishop had given her some religious notes, but the outline of her speech was her own, and the speech lasted for 7 minutes. Elizabeth said the women of Poland deserved deep and abiding sympathy. They were the first to deal with war. She thanked the women of France for sharing the hardships and sorrows of war. She also thanked the women of the English Empire for taking on task in every field of the national service. She also brought up that many people have seen their family life break up, with husbands going off to war and kids having to be evacuated for their safety. She mentioned that her and the king knew how they felt about having their daughters away from them. Bertie listened on the radio in the other room and felt she did it very well. It was said she was a natural. She had a clear, soft voice. She sounded youthful and soothing, and it sounded like she was having a conversation with the people. And the people responded as far away as Adelaide, Australia, and they sent messages of thanks. So the Bertie was kind of upset with Franklin Roosevelt. He couldn't understand why he was failing to deliver on the promises that he had given when they were at Hyde Park. Bertie wrote in his diary that he was very angry. The U.S. administration and the USA aren't doing nothing until after the presidential election in November. The phony war in Britain got real when Hitler invaded Norway and had taken over Denmark April the 9th. The British and French governments sent troops to Norway, but they withdrew when they were overwhelmed in the early May. Germany also invaded Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg and attacked France. No one in England had faith in Prime Minister Chamberlain, so George VI asked Viscount Halifax to take over, but he declined because he was serving in the House of Lords. It was then that Bertie knew that Winston Churchill, was the only person for the job. When Churchill got to Buckingham Palace, he pledged to form a government. and Bertie said he was full of fire and determination. Bertie and Elizabeth were sorry to see Chamberlain go. Lilibet was also sad it was not going to be that he was not going to be the prime minister. And when she heard his resignation speech on the radio, she told her mother, "I cried, Mummy." Bertie thought the French military was strong, but he found out differently. On May 21st, George VI wrote in his diary, "The French command is apparently hopeless." Soon England found itself blocked on 3 sides. The British troops had to fight to the French coast at Dunkirk. And then Churchill wanted to evacuate the entire army across the English Channel. They had to leave behind their guns, tanks, ammunition, and all stores. They knew there would be a large loss of lives. And the king gave a major radio speech on May 24th. He spoke for 12 minutes. He told the listeners, "The decisive struggle is now upon us. It is no mere territorial conquest that our enemies are seeking. It is the overthrow, complete and final, of this empire and of everything which it stands, and after that the conquest of the world." He ended the speech by saying, "With God's help, we shall not fail." So the king knew he gave a good speech. Later, he wrote in his diary, "I was very pleased with the way I delivered it. It was easily my best effort. How I hate broadcasting." So the end of June, the Battle of Britain started there with scattered attacks from German airplanes on ships in South Coast ports. So not much damage was done, but over the summer it got worse. Germany started to destroy the Royal Air Force. They hit factories, airfields, so that Hitler could invade Britain. Bertie and Elizabeth took a train to Hull in August, and they talked to the people whose houses were bombed. Bertie started to keep track of RAF and enemy losses with an air activity log in his diary. And Bertie wrote that it was the beginning of the German air blitzkrieg. Hermann Göring said it was Eagle Day, and he told Hitler it would take less than a week to crush the RAF. So Churchill gave a speech on August the 20th. He said that they would retaliate against Germany's military installations and factories and would continue to do so until the end of the war. At the end of August, the Luftwaffe bombers struck Leicester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, as well as other cities, and it caused death and destruction. August 24th, George VI and his family had to go to an air raid shelter under Windsor Castle. It was midnight, and they stayed there for 2 hours. Elizabeth said she hated to descend into the bowels of the earth to seek safety. And one morning, George VI found out that there was an unexploded bomb that landed next to Buckingham Palace. It was below the king's study and the queen's sitting room and dressing room on the north side of the building. After that incident at Buckingham Palace, Bertie and Elizabeth moved to Windsor Castle, and they stayed there for 14 months. And while they were at Windsor Castle, the royal family slept in the ground floor rooms of the Victoria Tower. They were fortified with concrete and sandbags and surrounded by scaffolding. They only went to the deep underground shelter when the bombings became intense. Now we're coming to the worst times. This started September 1940. On September the 9th, the king spent 3 hours with Captain Ewan Wallace, and he was commissioner for the London region, and they toured the bomb-damaged neighborhoods in the East End and the south of the Thames, and they visited several shelters. The king wanted to talk to everybody. The bomb that had not exploded at Buckingham Palace exploded September the 10th, and it made a block of Portland stone that weighed 2 tons go 20 feet up in the air. It greatly damaged a swimming pool that the king had built for his daughters 2 years before. The blast shattered all the windows on the north front. The floors were covered with glass and other debris, and the palace would take 9 direct hits, and the last one occurred late June 1944. So the king and queen went to London and inspected the damage and collect belongings to take back to Windsor, and they would have weekly luncheons with Winston Churchill. They allowed no servants, and it made for a relaxed mood. They would have grilled fish or chicken and poured whiskey and bourbon from small decanters. There were plenty of cigarettes for the king and 2 or 3 cigars for Churchill. So Churchill got to be on good terms with the king, and the queen was allowed to join them, which showed how much Churchill trusted her too. In the book George VI and Elizabeth, the king didn't say what the queen's role was during the wide-range discussions. Years later, Elizabeth said, "The king told me everything. There was only us." So it isn't known if she was in on secret Enigma intelligence, but it is thought that maybe she was, since Bertie was so close to Elizabeth. And after the initial luncheon, the king and queen went outside with Churchill to show him the damage. The secretary arranged for 40 journalists and photographers to be there too. And the secretary thought that it would be good for the American press to use the information also. So the king returned to the East End to observe damages, and he took the queen with him this time. And while they were there was an air raid alarm that sounded, and a police car had to speed them to a basement at the Lewisham police station. They went to a dimly lit shelter, and the police there and the court officials and staff couldn't believe their eyes. Then they burst into cheers when they saw the royal couple. So the royal couple sat down, and George VI lit a cigarette, and they waited to have tea. Well, the danger ended before the tea was served, but the king wanted to stay. Canteen workers served them biscuits along with the tea in thick china cups, and the queen said it was delicious. And one night they got to the palace. It was pouring rain. It was a Friday, and they'd been bombed on Tuesday. It had blown out the windows in their rooms, and they moved their quarters into a suite overlooking the quadrangle, which was the central courtyard. And when it was midday, an air raid siren went off. The king was in the sitting room, and he asked the queen to remove a lash from his eye. So just about that time, they heard an aircraft making a zooming noise above us, George VI wrote, and they saw 2 bombs falling. And they heard 2 resounding crashes as the bombs fell in the quadrangle about 30 yards away. So Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary, the noise of the aircraft dividing at great speed, and the scream of the bomb was followed by the explosion and a great column of smoke and earth thrown up in the air. And the king and the queen looked at each other and dashed to safety. Another explosion happened, and they stood there with the palace pages. The king said, "We all wondered why we weren't dead. They escaped injury and death, and they didn't tell anyone what a close call it was, except for family and a few members of the household." The Times paper stated that the eyewitnesses saw the airplane diving out of a cloud bank, and the pilot was flying low over the palace and releasing the whistling bombs, and then quickly disappeared back into the cloud bank. The 2 bombs made huge craters, and it ruptured a water main that made a 10-foot-high fountain, and the windows on the south side of the inner quadrangle were shattered, and there were bomb fragments that marked the walls. The worst damage was to the private chapel in the south wing of the palace. It was destroyed by a direct hit. The king and the queen still took a tour of the damage in the east and west ham, and an official thought the majesties appeared to be quite unshaken by their experience. But inside, Elizabeth was feeling emotions, and she told Queen Mary that as they walked down an empty street, past evacuated houses, it felt like a dead city. Queen Elizabeth said, "It does affect me seeing this terrible and senseless destruction. I think that really I mind it much more than being bombed myself. The people are marvelous and full of fight." The king described the palace bombing as a ghastly experience, and I don't want it to be repeated. It certainly teaches one to take cover on all future occasions, but one must be careful not to become dugout-minded. Fortunately, he was able to sleep well that night. So I will end the video here. Can't imagine the horrors that the people in England and the king and the queen had to endure during those days of endless bombings. And even though the cities were being destroyed as well as the palace, the people remained in high spirits and were ready to do anything it took to retain their freedom. In the next video, I'll take us past the war, and we'll see how the king and queen did once all that nightmare was over. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. If you haven't hit the notification bell, if you could do that, you'll be able to see whenever new videos are posted. Learning about Queen Elizabeth's parents it's easy to see where she got her sense of duty, steely determination, and positive thinking from. Her parents were the best role models that she and the United Kingdom could have asked for. So I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.